Hello everyone, my name is Mike Kolbeck, and today I'll be telling you about neural networks and their role in computational neuroscience. So as we discussed in class, neural networks are a type of artificial intelligent agent based on the general structure of the brain. Computational neuroscience is a study of the brain as an information processing system. So how does the brain work as a computer? For this class, I'm going to be discussing how neural networks work as a modeling tool for brains, going over a couple case studies of when it works successfully as a model and when it doesn't, and maybe to go over some ways that neural networks can actually help with the processing of neuroscience data and break some new ground that way. So, how effective is an artificial neural network as a model for actual brain activity? Well, they're generally pretty similar. Information goes in one end, some kind of magic happens, and it either fires to the next neuron or it doesn't. And if you're just studying how information propagates through a simple forward-feeding system, like the ones we discussed in class, artificial neural networks are pretty good. That said, the brain is a complicated organ, and sometimes tweaks need to happen in order for it to model the kind of theoretical behavior that you're looking for in an actual brain study. I'll give you an example. So information travels through a brain at about 268 miles per hour. This is much slower than the speed at which information travels through a computer. But this is actually a feature because brains can encode information temporally. So rather than maybe, say, taking a look at two pandas, making a panda object for each one of them in memory, and then having to iterate through both of them sequentially, a brain can actually juggle information where maybe this panda is this red firing, this one is this blue one, and when those different signals arrive, allow it to separate out different objects or different concepts rather than having to tag them in some way, saving information by encoding it in when it arrives, not just from what neurons does it arrive, or does it arrive or not. If that wasn't complicated enough, the neural networks that we're familiar with kind of go in one direction. So input goes in the input layer, passes through several hidden layers, and it passes out of some output layer through kind of a forward-feeding sort of system. But brains can be a little bit more complicated than that. Sometimes information goes in and comes out the other end, or sometimes it loops around a couple times, sometimes it comes up here, goes down here, goes out there. Information can flow in a more complicated cyclical pattern. So if you wanted to model these kind of things using artificial neural network, you'd have to make some changes. Here are just a couple of examples. Very early, as kind of an improvement from the initial perceptron type of neural network, they developed something called spiking neural networks, where when you have one neuron, rather than just firing or not based on whether it receives an input, it kind of counts up the amount of inputs it's getting and then only fires once it exceeds a certain threshold, just like an actual neuron would. And this kind of mimics that temporal firing where a bunch of other neurons before it have to hit it all at once to fire, rather than a bunch of them separated out over time. Now to model that cyclical nature of the brain, some neural networks have been created that recur back on themselves. So information goes in one neuron and it kind of passes around in kind of an infinite, almost an infinite loop of hidden layers until some exit condition happens and it leaves. These have actually exhibited some pretty interesting dynamic behavior and have made them pretty useful as models of just some of the intricacies of the brain. Now, how effective are all these models actually? Well, it turns out in some cases really good. Just the type of artificial neural network that we've sort of seen the most often, that kind of forward-propagating one, actually in image recognition works very similar to how they think the inferior temporal cortex works. And ones that more closely match those patterns tend to do better in performance metrics. Now, the IT favors categorization. Networks that favor categorization do very well, but it's kind of hard to say whether or not that's just a correlation or if one of them, they're actually kind of causing each other. There's some actual thing under the hood that's similar. One way that we've kind of tried to figure out how these systems are similar in brains and artificial neural networks is to kind of throw false inputs at them and see if they both make errors. If you can create an optical illusion for a human and it throws off a computer or vice versa, you've got a pretty good hint that maybe something is in common under the hood. So far, there haven't been a lot of success with these studies, but then again, things that throw off one AI don't throw off other AIs, so it's very much a kind of experiment in its infancy. Now, finally, while neural networks are useful as a model, they're also useful for just analyzing information in neuroscience too, and they're actually breaking some pretty important ground. One of the holy grails of neuroscience is something called the connectome, which is sort of like a map of all the neurons and all of their connections in the human brain, a giant graph, like a genome but for neurons. The problem is that it's very difficult to actually build this. Neurons kind of all sort of blend together, and you have petabytes of these kinds of images with an individual neuron transcending maybe hundreds of these slides. Now, actually deciphering which neuron is which in this bowl of spaghetti is something that typically humans have had to do, but is now being kind of offshored onto artificial neural networks. Basically, you have these artificial brains looking at these images of real brains to make a giant artificial image of the entire human brain so you can better understand the real human brain. That's pretty cool. Take care, everyone. Bye.